Now, before we start, I want to make something perfectly clear to you guys. I am not a World War One historian. In fact, I haven't read a lot of books about World War One. I only have ever had one college class discuss World War One, and from a U.S. perspective, we don't really do all that much in World War One. So we won't talk about any battles. If you want to discuss the military history of the war, I will provide some resources below. Now, how America gets involved in this war is kind of a big, long, convoluted story with a lot of moving pieces. The good news is, according to the College Board, there's a lot of material you don't have to really know anymore. I'll leave it in this video, but don't be confused if the particulars, you know, don't make a lot of sense or you're kind of confused about the particulars. That's fine. The good news is you don't need to know all these individual people anymore. As long as you know the bigger general theme, you'll be okay. Don't freak out. This chapter really isn't that bad. Let's move on. Let's look at our goals for this chapter. The first thing we have to look at is America's growing imperialism and how that changed our national policies during this time period. We also have to figure out exactly how World War One started because, turns out that's what the chapter is titled. Then we need to figure out why the U.S. entered this war in Europe. It's going to be a drastic change. We're going to talk about that for a while. Then we're going to figure out how are people in the United States affected by this war. And we're going to discuss how that works. And then finally, we're going to figure out when this war ends, what is America's role in the end of this war? That's what we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Hopefully, when you finish going through this, you could provide a detailed answer to either any of those goals. Let's get started. There is no more logical place to discuss World War I than starting in China. Okay, now that you're done laughing, well, why? Why would we start a discussion of World War I in China, a place that, as far as many of you guys have probably learned in world history, had nothing to do with World War I? Well, let's figure this out. The bigger theme we have to figure out here is this theme that we've talked about before, American imperialism. As we talked about with America in the 1890s, we have big business that's growing and growing and growing. And it's getting to a point that big businesses can make more stuff than Americans can buy. So what do those businesses need to do? They need to sell things other places. That's going to be the change in how America is going to be working. We go from an isolationist country that doesn't care about the rest of the world to a country that's going to be concerned about the rest of the world because we can sell our crap there. That's basically going to be the premise of what's going on. We can sell our stuff. Now we want to play in the rest of the world. So as 1890 turns into 1900, this process is continuing. And now let's just hit China in 1910 as a good idea of how America is going to change its policies because we want to support big business. I'll say it again. We're going to change our policies and our political philosophies because we want to support big business. We want to make money. So, a great place to try to make money is China. Why? There are hundreds of millions of people living there, even at this time period, and they've been relatively isolated from the rest of the Western world. So, that's a pretty good place to sell all of our stuff, don't you think? However, the United States is not the only country to get this idea of going into China to sell supplies. In fact, we're the last one to make it there. France, Britain, Germany, even Japan had made it into China already to try to sell stuff. We're late to the party. So we're late to this party, and we basically demand the Chinese government to give us a sphere of influence. What China did, which is actually pretty smart if you think about it, they realized that other countries want to trade with them. But rather than have a whole bunch of countries fighting in China over who can be where, China goes, okay, I'm going to give France this southern section. We'll call that your sphere of influence. I'm going to give Britain this middle section. We'll call it Britain's sphere of influence. That way, there's going to be some separation between the competing colonizing countries, and they're not going to want to fight in China. That's the last thing China wants. Well, the U.S. is late to this party and says, hey, we want a sphere of influence. And China basically goes, hey, look, we're pretty much already sphered out or influenced out, as it were. So that's not going to work. Well, then the United States goes, what if we have an open door policy and it basically says that we can trade with China anywhere we want and we don't care about spheres of influence? And China goes, no. Um, in fact, China at this time is also getting concerned about Western influence in general, so they don't want us there. They don't want anyone there. And in retaliation to this Western influence, a little rebellion breaks out in China. It's called the Boxer Rebellion. Basically, the idea here is a bunch of Chinese, I don't want to call them radicals, but these people that don't like Western influence are going to try to remove all the non-Chinese people by force. Now, to stop this rebellion, the United States brings in a couple thousand troops into China to suppress this rebellion. Long story short, it's a very long story, but to make it short, because the United States helps stop this rebellion that happened because they didn't want the United States there, we kind of get this basic policy that says, okay, you know what? We are going to stay in China, we're going to trade with China, and we're going to keep our military there to make sure that there's no more rebellions or crazy riots. We call it the open door notes. Now, here's what you have to get out of this story. The United States, because we want to sell things to a different country, we're going to use our military, we're going to use our government, and we're going to use our businesses to insert ourselves into a country that doesn't want us there. We're going to violate pretty much everything that we've ever believed as a country simply for business interests. That's kind of what I want you guys to get out of this. Let's move on to the next example. I'll try to make this story as brief as I can, but remember, the theme here is America changes its legal practices and political practices because of business. So what's another example of us doing this? Well, we want to trade with the rest of the world, but the problem is most of our manufacturing is on the East Coast, and the people we want to trade with are in Asia. It's a very long way to get from the East Coast to Asia, and it's a very long way to get from the East Coast to California. So what do people do? What if we were to build a hole, a big giant trench basically, that cut across the continent and made it so you could sail from one side to the other without having to go all the way around South America? That is the idea of the Panama Canal. We've already seen this done successfully with the Suez Canal, which of course is in Africa, and it cuts the Mediterranean Sea and makes it easier to get to the Indian Ocean. So we've already seen this done before, and we want to basically do the same policy. Now, a very, very, very long story. It's actually a 700-page book, which is fascinating, but we don't have to worry about it. The French try to build this canal in Panama first, but they fail miserably, mainly because this is going to be happening in the subtropical region of Panama, which is prone to many viruses and infections and things like yellow fever, which the French didn't understand and couldn't control. Thousands of French people die, and they say, you know what? Maybe this is a bad idea. So, little foreshadowing, the French screw something up and we have to come in and fix it. That's exactly what the United States does. We decide to go into Panama and build this canal ourselves because the French had failed. Now, it's a really long, complicated story, but Panama as a country didn't exist yet. We call this the Panama Canal, but really Panama at this time period is part of a country called Colombia. And Colombia is not too happy with this idea of cutting up their land to make Americans more money. The Colombians don't want this. So what does the United States do? Well, we basically start a civil insurrection in the Isthmus of Panama. We send our military there, even though we don't use them. We send our military there and have a government overthrow in Panama, create our own country, and then install our own leader that's going to agree with whatever policy we want. That's essentially what happens. Is there a lot more you can read about that? Is there a lot more you can discuss about Felipe Varela? Sure. Are we going to worry about it? No. Long story short, though, let's recap what just happened. The United States is going to overthrow a foreign government, cut up their territory, and then dig a big giant hole simply for business interest. That is the Panama Canal. I think this is kind of showing you how America is changing our policies. Now, let's talk about the rest of Latin America. Remember the Monroe Doctrine? Remember that doctrine that said, hey, Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere? Well, during this time period, we're basically going to reaffirm that idea. You know, it's been a good 80 years since that document was made. It's now 1904, and Roosevelt's going to say, hey, you know what? Europe, I want to remind you again, stay out. And in fact, if you do get in here, we are going to punch you right in the face, and we're ready to do it. It helps that the United States had won the Spanish-American War pretty handily. So Europe, to be honest, is kind of afraid of us. We just beat a European power in a war. This is kind of where this idea of speak softly but carry a big stick came from. It becomes Roosevelt's like catchphrase. And whenever you see a political cartoon of him, sometimes he'll have a really big stick. The idea here is we kind of threaten Europe, and then we also have a military to back it up should it be necessary. That's kind of what it means. Now, Taft is going to continue our business interest in Latin America. He calls this dollar diplomacy. What this means is that the United States is not going to take over any more land, but our goal in Latin America now is to keep Latin America dependent on trade. That way they keep talking to us and keep trading with us and making money from us. That's dollar diplomacy. Sweet. Let's move on. Now, this story is actually going to continue even more now that Woodrow Wilson is president. It is now 1912. Woodrow Wilson is president, and he's basically going to keep this same idea going. Now, Wilson's a little bit of an idealist. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But at the same time, American business is always going to basically call his shots in America during this time period. There's going to be a problem, though. Turns out that there is I don't want to call it a civil war going on in Mexico, but Mexico's got some crazy problems going on during this time period. In fact, Mexico gets its independence in 1820, but it never has a strong internal government, and there's going to be a whole bunch of factions constantly going, trying to gain power. In 1913, a revolution breaks out in Panama. In fact, the United States had 40,000 people. Did I say Panama? I meant Mexico. In 1913, a revolution is going to break out in Mexico. The United States had 40,000 people living there, and we had over $2 billion worth of business investments in the region. Basically, we're concerned that if Mexico goes through a revolution, those 40,000 U.S. citizens could be in danger, as well as the $2 billion in investments could be in danger. The current leader of Mexico is this dude named General Victoriano Huerta, who the United States is not really all that happy with. In fact, we're so angry with him that we're going to sell weapons to his opponent. His name is, well, Carranza. I'm not sure how you pronounce that first name. Essentially, long story short, Huerta is going to disappear and abdicate, and now we have a new government being controlled by the person that the United States backed. Kind of a cool story, right? Wait a minute. Are you saying that the United States was part of a process to overthrow a democratically elected leader of a foreign country simply so we can keep Americans safe and keep business interests going? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. We do it a lot. Now, there's this dude. His name is Pancho Villa. He is pictured there in the bottom right. He is not happy with this whole process. And in fact, he's going to bring in some soldiers and try to invade the United States. Well, we're not going to be cool with that. We don't want the United States invaded. So what do? We send 150,000 American soldiers to the Mexican border to find Pancho Villa. This is America's response to us being threatened. Now again, why does your textbook throw all this in here? It's trying to build some themes. America changes its policy for big business, and as we see here with Pancho Villa, America has no problem using troops to defend its national integrity, as it were. Let's see what happens here when this is applied on a European scale. Okay, let me recap what you should have learned about in world history last year. I'm sure you did, but at the same time, you've probably forgotten everything you've learned. So let's recap because it's important to understand why World War I breaks out, and then we'll figure out how does the U.S. fit into this story. Now, ironically, Europe has been in a period of relative peace since Napoleon's been captured. In fact, for almost 100 years, Europe's going to stay relatively peaceful while they're busy industrializing and imperializing the rest of the world. So that's pretty good. Europe's actually going to be peaceful. It's kind of weird. But when they go to war, oh man, they go to war. The simplest way to realize the process of how Europe ends up falling like dominoes into a big giant war is to realize that there are four main MAIN causes. Let's go through each one. The first one is militarism, which means the glorification of armed strength. Countries like Britain, France, Russia, and Germany, those names are going to sound familiar to you, are really big on supporting the military and having almost like a passion behind military service. If you are a military serviceman, you are a hero. It's every male should attempt to be that. That's what every male should go for. There is a love and a dedication to the military that happens there. Next, after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe's going to make a complex web of treaties and a complex web of alliances, basically to keep some semblance of a balance of power. This is known as the Concert of Europe, and again, I'm just repeating what you heard last year, so I won't go into a lot of detail. Plus, it doesn't really matter for APUS. The first alliance that matters here is called the Triple Alliance, which is between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The basic premise is, if one country is attacked by another power, all three will join in and fight that power. So for example, if Austria-Hungary is attacked by someone, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy will respond. That's how these alliance works. The other side here is called the Triple Entente, or the Triple Entente. This is France and Russia agreeing to work together, and Great Britain's also going to be involved with this as well. Again, the idea here is to keep these countries equal in power. By doing this, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy become equally as powerful as Germany, France, and Russia. That's the idea behind alliances. The next idea here is imperialism. Essentially what's happening here is that you want to control more land and control more control other countries to keep your business interests running. That's still going to be going on, and right now, some countries are becoming more powerful than others. If you want to get technical, this place called the Ottoman Empire, you know it as Turkey, is starting to crumble, so there's some land there that can be taken. Germany has basically created itself. Germany didn't exist as a country until 1870, so it's starting to amass land, and it's becoming threatening to the rest of the main alliances that are going on here. Finally, we have nationalism, which is great pride in your country. Essentially here, nationalism means that you should be proud to be a German, and you don't want to be conquered or controlled by anyone else. You should be proud to be French, or a Serbian, or an Austro-Hungarian. You should be proud to have that nationality, and you should support that in all means, in all things. That's kind of what's going to happen. If someone tries to come over and take over your land, you're going to want to punch them in the face. If someone's going to tell you that you can't speak your language anymore, you're going to want to punch them in the face. That's essentially what happens here. Okay, here are all of the alliances. Here is what it looks like before World War I breaks out. You can see this complex web and series of alliances, but essentially, let's pretend that Italy attacks France. Well, if Italy attacks France, then Russia, Great Britain, and France are going to attack Italy. But if Italy is attacked, Germany and Austria-Hungary are going to go ahead and protect Italy and fight back as well. It gets even more complicated because the Ottoman Empire ends up here, and then, as you can see here in purple, Serbia and Bulgaria are also going to be involved in this complex web. What a crazy, horrible story, right? Yeah, that's essentially what it looks like. Now that you know all the main causes, let's see what actually leads to the event. Now, in my infinite benevolence, I went ahead and just put this all up here so you guys can copy it down. Now, I could just sit here awkwardly and quietly while you do that, or I could read it. I like the sound of my own voice, so I'm going to read it. Maybe add some other tidbits in here. Serbia is a relatively small country, but they want to expand their influence throughout the rest of Europe. Specifically, they want to take over their neighbors who are pretty weak. You know that area as Bosnia Herzegovina. Bosnia. Russia is going to be cool with this move. Russia and Serbia are BFFs. Meanwhile, Austria Hungary to the north had the exact same idea. They also wanted to take over um, weak Bosnia. They call it when one country takes over another one without a war, it's called annexing. No one's really happy that this has gone down. In 1914, the Archduke of Austria, his name is Franz Ferdinand, is going to make a appearance in Bosnia. So basically, here's what happens. Austria-Hungary takes over Bosnia and goes, all right, you guys are all part of us now. I don't care what your previous nationality was. I don't even care what your language is. I rule you. And then the Archduke, this leader, not the top leader, but a leader in Austria, decides he wants to have a little parade for himself. He's going to have a parade and go down through Bosnia and go, hey guys, look, I own you now. You all have to bow down to me. Well, a Serbian nationalist group. Basically, I don't want to call them terrorists, but what the heck, let's call them terrorists. A bunch of Serbian terrorists are really upset that they don't control Bosnia. But wait a minute, we wanted to control Bosnia. Why can't we control it? Lousy Austro-Hungarians. So this group called the Black Hand, which is going to be a kind of a terrorist group, made up of teenagers no less, devised this complicated assassination scheme. They figure if they, a bunch of Serbians, assassinate the leader or a leader in Austria named Franz Ferdinand, it would show that Serbia is a dominant power, then Bosnia would belong to Serbia. Does this seem complicated? It is. But here's the good thing. This is all world history stuff. It doesn't really matter for the AP exam. I'm just telling it to you so that way you understand, or at least have some idea how this whole thing gets started. Oh, but wait, it gets more complicated. Next slide. Austria-Hungary is going to blame Serbia for the assassination. Even though Serbia had really nothing to do with it, it was a terrorist group inside of Serbia. And they declare open war on them. Now, because Russia is allies with Serbia, Russia prepares for war. Germany, who is allies with Austria-Hungary, declares war on Russia and then war on France, knowing that essentially through this complex web of alliances, it's going to happen that way anyway. Britain declares war on Germany, and now, congratulations, we have a big, giant, complex war. There are two sides to this war. On one side, we have Germany and Austria-Hungary. We'll call that the Central Powers. And then on the other side, we have Great Britain, Russia, and France. We'll call that the Allied Powers. But to be honest, this is really Germany versus Great Britain, Russia, and France. How powerful is Germany as a military force? How powerful is the German army, and how powerful are the German people, and how skilled are they in war? It's basically Germany versus the rest of Europe, and Germany essentially wins this war most of the way through. Now, why does this relate to U.S. history? What is the United States doing during this entire time? Oh, the U.S. remains neutral. At first, we're going to remain neutral, but we're actually going to sell weapons to both sides. Now, that's kind of a lie. We actually sell significantly more weapons to the Allied powers, but we're going to sell weapons to both sides. Europe is basically going to bankrupt itself over the next couple of years, trying to buy bigger and better weapons. The United States is going to be selling or making and selling those weapons to them. What's really interesting about World War I is there's a huge economic transfer of wealth. Europe is where all the money in the world is, and at the end of this war, Europe is almost completely bankrupt and the United States is rich. How did that happen? We basically sell weapons to both sides, encourage them to keep beating the crud out of each other, and then make money the entire way. It's actually how America ends up as a world superpower. We take all the money away from Europe while Europe's busy fighting itself. And we encourage them to do it. America. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead 4 years. Well, 3 years. If you're really curious as to what happens in those intervening 3 years, I will link some information about what happens. What happens when the rest of Europe is busy fighting. You're more than welcome to look into it. But I'm going to go ahead and assume you don't care, so let's just go ahead and talk about what happens with the United States. The United States is going to remain neutral as long as possible in this war. Look, This is a war between European nations. And guess what? The United States is made up of European immigrants. So we don't want to pick a side. I mean, think about it. There are 5 million Germans living in the United States. How are they going to respond if the United States all of a sudden decides to support the Allied powers? The same is true going the opposite way. There are millions of people from Great Britain, France, and Russia in the United States. What happens if we support Germany? Are they going to rebel? Are they going to have insurrections against us? What would happen to our shores if this were to go down? Would this lead to another American Civil War? You guys laugh, but this could actually be a serious problem. So the United States wants to stay neutral. We don't want to get in the fight. We tell both sides, we are out of this. We are not going to join either side. We'll sell you weapons, but we are not, I repeat, we are not going to get in on the fight. Well, how do we get involved in the fight? Glad you asked. So the war is intensifying over the years. So the war starts in 1914, and it's building and building and building over 1914, 15, and 16. Millions of soldiers are dead on both sides. And as the war intensifies, basically the costs become bigger and the implications become bigger. Now the war is going to ramp up. What starts to happen is that there's going to be attacks on pretty much any ship in the ocean. If we want to get into a military strategy standpoint here, if we know for a fact the United States is shipping goods, weapons, food, maybe even money across the Atlantic Ocean, wouldn't it make sense for both sides to just blow up any American ship you see? Or any ship that you see? Basically, the Germans are going to say, if there is a ship that is sailing in the ocean, we are going to blow it up. Because more often than not, that ship is going to be carrying munitions or supplies for the Allied power war effort. The Germans are going to say, this isn't fair, this is not going well, so we're going to start blowing up ships. In fact, the Germans even argue in something that's a total war, so a big, massive war like World War I, there's no such thing as someone remaining neutral. There's no such thing as a civilian. Why is that? Well, if America's making weapons, or if civilians are making weapons that soldiers are using to blow each other up, aren't Americans or civilians culpable? Like, didn't America have some role in this war even though we weren't fighting? We're making the weapons. So, really, we're just as, we're just as big of a reason why this war is going on as the actual soldiers. So, from Germany's perspective, and even from Great Britain's perspective, America can't remain neutral. What happens? What really happens here? Well, the Germans are going to sink a ship. They're going to do something called unrestricted submarine warfare. And basically, they are going to sink a ship. It's called the HMS Lusitania. This is not an American ship. This is a British ship that has Americans on it. 128 Americans are on this ship. But this ship also possibly had munitions and had food that were going to be sent to Great Britain to help them in the war effort. Wilson is furious, and he yells at Germany and says, "How dare you blow up a ship with Americans on it when you promised that you wouldn't?" Wilson's sending an empty threat here, though. That's just kind of what he does. Now, I'm giving you one example. This is one ship that blows up that has Americans on it, but there are actually hundreds of ships that are blown up between 1914 and 1917 that upset the Americans, even though we say unrestricted submarine warfare is bad. It's still going to keep happening. What actually leads the United States into the war? Well, there's a whole bunch of things that go on, but the fun one that I like to talk about is something called the Zimmerman Note. So, on one end, we have unrestricted submarine warfare going on. We have American ships being blown up, and we are not happy about it. And then America catches wind of something called the Zimmerman Note. Here's what happens. We get word of a secret telegram that the Germans had sent to Mexico. The basic telegram says this: "Hey, Mexico, if you build an army and then attack the United States and distract them, once the Germans win this war, we will then help you regain lost territory from the Mexican American War. You know, California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado. We'll help you get Utah. We'll help you get all of that land back if you just do this the slight little favor of attacking the United States and encouraging them into war and distracting them from the European war. That's the Zimmerman Note. Now, America catches wind of this um, and says, whoa, 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 this is not cool. Basically, at this point, we've decided that the Germans are the bad guys and that we need to fight the Germans. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson's going to stand up in front of Congress and he actually declares war. He doesn't ask Congress to declare war. He basically says, hey, a state of war exists, so let's get to it, kids. And they pretty much agree. Why? Why should America enter a war? And why do we get involved in this big, crazy, awful, horrible war? I can think of 4 reasons. Number 1, the Germans are attacking and sinking ships, both American ships and ships that have Americans sailing on them. That bothers us. Number 2, the U.S. has economic interest in the Allied nations. So there are a lot of businesses in Western Europe that we are doing trade with. If Western Europe ceases to exist, what happens to that trade? Number 3, while there are a lot of Germans living in the United States, we have a much stronger cultural heritage to the Allied powers than we do the Central powers. But finally, number 4, it's really all about money. The United States wants to keep business interests alive. We have a vested interest in making sure that capitalism and democracy exist in Europe. If capitalism and democracy exist in Europe, we can make money with them. The Allied powers are the best chance we have of keeping that going. The United States has now entered World War I. Now, it's April of 1917 when the United States declares war. A war in Europe has been going on for 3 years. Millions of Europeans are dead during this time period. This war is awful, awful, horrible, atrocious war. Leave it to America. We see this big, crazy, horrible war going on for 3.5 years, and we sit there and watch it. In fact, we build weapons for both sides to use against each other, and the entire time, the United States is not even remotely prepared for a war at all. In fact, our army only has 120,000 men in it, most of which had 0 combat experience. Most of our officers had never led a man in battle, and many were aged and waiting for retirement. The United States had no modern naval ships, had no ammunition because we'd sold all of it, and if we decide to fight, we have to bring every single thing with us to Europe. We're not ready for a war, and we're not ready for a world war. We are so far behind. Big, crazy, horrible war is breaking out. The United States does nothing to protect itself. That's how serious I am when I say that we are neutral and want to be neutral. But you know what? We've declared war. We've got to get into the fight. We have to mobilize, which means to prepare. We have to mobilize, and we have to do it quickly. And of course, by quickly means it's going to take us about a year to get ready. Those of you World War I historians know that this war ends in 1919, and the war basically ends right when we show up because it takes us so long to get ready. This dude, his name is Newton Baker, he's a Secretary of War, and it's his job to mobilize the U.S. Army. In May of 1917, he sets up something called the Selective Service Act. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's called the draft. It's going to require all men between the ages of 18 and 45 to register for a draft. Basically, America needs to get soldiers. What's interesting, though, is that 24 million men are going to register with the Selective Service, and over 3 million men are eventually going to end up being drafted into the American military, with over 2 million men being sent to Europe. In fact, how many men are sent to Europe? By the summer of 1918, a year after the draft is called for, 10,000 U.S. soldiers are sent to Europe every single day. But the weird thing is, they don't do a lot of fighting, but we'll talk about that. Training camps had to be set up all across the United States in order to train men in military life. Soldiers were told to forget about their home life, and they were told to stop drinking alcohol and avoid any sexual contact with women, especially in Europe. Because the thought was, as you can see from this political cartoon, she may look clean, but prostitutes spread venereal diseases. You can't beat the Axis powers if you get venereal diseases. Oh boy. That's a propaganda poster that was out during this time period. The training for the United States. A soldier took 8 months to be trained at 17 hours per day training. And, other side note, segregation is still in full effect. Over 260,000 black Americans are going to join the armed services, but few actually see combat, and very few are integrated with whites in the front lines. Let's talk about the economy. So, this is what we call a total war, which means that this war is actually going to be not only a war that is going to involve the military, it's actually going to change the entire American economy. We've set up our economy based on industrialization in the past, but now we're going to go hardcore, full-scale industrialization. In fact, one of the lasting legacies of this war, even though we don't do a lot of fighting, it pushes the United States fully into the modern world, especially when it comes to the economy and production. Almost immediately, once the war takes place, the American government starts to regulate business. They're going to say, hey, you know what? You used to make automobiles, now you're making tanks. You used to make, I don't know, brooms, now you're making guns, because that's relevant. The government's basically going to say, this is what's going to be made. You don't get a choice, you are making this. They basically essentially take over industries. You're going to see this again in World War II. In fact, that's why a lot of this seems so similar once we get to it. The War Industries Board is going to be established in order to coordinate military purchasing, ensure production efficiency, and provide weapons and equipment to soldiers all over the world. It's going to control the entire industrial sector and basically took over businesses and said, okay, you're working for the war effort now. It also pretty much standardized any product that it wanted to use. It actually is a good way of making products so similar by making them all standardized. Works out pretty well. The Fuel Administration and the Food Administration are going to regulate coal usage and oversaw the production of food for soldiers. What does this do? It basically makes sure that we have enough materials in this country to keep everything running, and it makes sure that the army has enough food. Turns out a military or an army basically marches on its stomach. No food, no war. Now, the government is actually no longer concerned with trust. Many historians say World War I is the end of the progressive era, and the reason for that is the government's not going to break up trust anymore. In fact, the government's going to be encouraging trust. They want one business to make all the guns, because that way they're all going to be the exact same. They're all going to work. It's kind of weird that the way that we destroy big business is by actually bringing big business back. America. All commercial production ceased in the country. Almost every industry was taken over by the military. Let's just say you wanted to buy a car. They're not going to be available. Every single car that would have been made is now going to be sent over to Europe. You can't buy consumer goods. Everything's going to be done for war production. Let's talk about actual fighting in the war. I'll keep this short because we don't do much. The American Expeditionary Force is going to be led by a dude named General Pershing. He wants the United States not to be a reinforcement for the Allies because they're fighting like maniacs. Instead, we want our military to kind of act on its own. This ends up being a good thing. We realize that the Allies' powers are weak from a 3-year war, and we don't just want Americans to just basically get slaughtered like the Europeans have been slaughtered. Again, feel free to look at any of the resources I provided below on how the Europeans have been slaughtered. There's several battles where 10,000 people are killed in 5 minutes. Yeah, we don't want to be involved in that. In fact, the mere fact that the United States is going to show up at all is going to be really what kind of turns the tide of this war. The Germans are actually doing pretty well, kicking the French and the British's butts, but the fact that the United States is going to show up just makes the Germans go, oh my God, Now we have a whole nother country we have to beat, and by the way, they're fresh. This is not going to be easy for us. Not going to be easy at all. Let's talk about how the actual fighting went on. We'll do an activity in class about trench warfare, so I won't spend too much time on that here. But basically, trench warfare is pretty crazy stuff. It's pretty crazy, horrible fighting. But the worst part about it was the fact that you're going to be sitting in these trenches for weeks or months on end. And in Europe, it tends to rain a lot. So you're going to get all this water going into the trenches. It actually makes your feet look like that picture there in the bottom left. Gross, right? On top of that, you're going to have really horrible shell shock, which is basically a way of thinking of post traumatic stress disorder. You're basically living in a world where you can be constantly killed at any moment. Every time you hear a gun go off or a bomb go off, it kind of gives you the shudders, and it makes it really difficult to actually get over what's happening in this war. And again, I'd love to talk more about this, but the United States doesn't do a lot of actual fighting. So that's not the story I have to tell. Sorry. One of the things that we need to discuss is about America on the home front. What the war looks like to the average American at home. Because again, the soldier story is not going to be all that interesting to us, but instead, we got to figure out, how do you convince Americans, many of whom are of German descent, to fight a war against Germany? How do you do it? The answer? Propaganda. The United States has to convince its citizens to fight a war that really we have no vested interest in. At least the average American doesn't. Sure, the average American should care if businesses are doing whatever they're doing, but to be honest, I mean, do you guys care if Microsoft makes money? Not really. Does it affect you? No. So, are you willing to go to war with, I don't know, Russia to make sure Microsoft makes more money? No. You're going to need a little bit better convincing than that. Well, that's what propaganda is for. Propaganda comes out and basically convinces Americans that the German people are these, look here in the bottom right, these brutal, awful, vicious monsters that are going to attack American chastity and American, I don't want to say the word prude, but basically they're going to attack American sensibilities, and they're going to be really harsh and evil. We can't have this here. Look at this picture in the center. You see the word Hun? That's what the word that was used for the Germans. Couldn't call them Germans, but the Hun brings up this idea of the Mongols, these horrible, vicious soldiers. It makes Americans think, wow, these German people are maniacs. Side note, it actually ends up being important because the Germans are actually a really good military. If we made a bunch of cartoons that made the Germans seem weak, Americans might not take them seriously, and the Germans can seriously kick butt in war. If you study world history, the Germans are pretty good at war. You don't want to take them lightly, and we don't. The Committee on Public Information is going to send out this propaganda. They release thousands upon thousands of these posters that are designed not only to encourage Americans to fight, but also to glorify war. At least Americans fighting war. They want to glorify it. We'll even listen to a little song in class that kind of shows how this whole thing goes down. In the short term, war is really good for the American economy. Pretty much every war is good for the American economy. The government is going to be buying supplies that the average American is going to be making. That average American is now going to have a job. That business is now going to make money from the U.S. government. And because there isn't any consumer production going on, you're going to have people working many, many hours a day with nothing to buy. War is very profitable for the United States on the short run. But you guys recognize a problem here? I said the American government is going to be buying supplies, paying Americans to build stuff. But where does the American government get its money? Oh, right, taxes. So yes, Americans are making a lot of money during this time period. But the bill for this war is going to become due one day, and it's going to have a drastic effect on the American economy eventually. But let's not discuss spoilers just yet. The civilian workforce during this time period is going to expand. Because with 3 million men in uniform, someone's got to fill their jobs, and now we need even more supplies. So we're going to make a whole bunch of new jobs to fill the 3 million men that have left for to go fight and for the additional production required. The US government's going to pay pretty well for the work that it requires, and wages increased 20% across the board in pretty much every industry. Labor unions were told by the US government it was anti American to go on strike, so they don't. With European farming disrupted during the war, prices for food skyrocketed, and farmers' income, the income for farmers, is going to increase. There's also going to be a heavy black migration during this time period. European immigration is going to be halted by the war. I mean, obviously, ships can't even make it here. So companies that needed workers are going to recruit people from the South. There are a bunch of blacks in the South that never really had a chance for upward economic mobility that are going to be asked to come to the North and work in factories and make more money. And they do. By 1920, 1.5 million blacks had left the South and gone into the North looking for work. This has a significant racial effect as blacks had little to no racial support in the North. This time period is going to lead to the growth of the NAACP and other racial equality movements. Again, there's a lot more to this story. I'm being kind of brief, but I promise we'll touch more on what effect this has in later chapters. Women are also going to be pivotal to the war effort. Ladies, this is something that happens every single time the boys go to war. The girls go into the factories and they kick some serious butt there, and production never goes down during wartime. It's funny, we built this entire society at this time period saying that women shouldn't be in factories, and then as soon as we need women in factories, they go there, do an awesome job. Maybe the impression that men had during the time period that women couldn't do it was wrong. Women are perfectly capable of it. In fact, women's work becomes so important and the role of women becomes so important that this is actually where the 19th Amendment comes from. Women's suffrage actually comes from a patriotic motion that happens during this time period. Women are working, they should deserve to be able to vote as well. Women are helping in this war effort. In fact, if we're so concerned about being patriotic, wouldn't giving women the right to vote just allow them to show their patriotism in support of America? It works. That's where the 19th Amendment comes from. What if I told you that more people died from the flu than died from deaths in World War I? It's true. There's going to be a really horrible flu that breaks out. It's called the Spanish influenza, even though it didn't start in Spain and the flu virus didn't speak Spanish or anything. But that's just kind of what we call it. This had nothing to do with the actual fighting. In fact, this is going to take places where this flu is going to be the most devastating in areas where the fighting is not taking place. Over 30 million people are going to die worldwide in 1 year just from the flu. Get your flu shots, kids. Now, did that actually have any real drastic importance to this chapter? No, I just think it's interesting information. Let's end this war. Now, America, bless our hearts, we enter this war late. And then, as this war is ending, we basically claim the victory for it and demand that we should have a say in what happens to the rest of the world. We've barely done any fighting. Very few Americans, relatively, have died in this war. And then we basically tell Europe, okay, now that we're here cleaning up your mess, this is how it's going to be. We're going to basically decide the treaty. We're basically going to decide the rest of the world. What kind of an arrogant jerk could possibly think that America can do so little in this war, yet have a complete determination on what's going to happen to the end of it? That's our president, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a brilliant idealist. He has these brilliant ideas, but he's kind of an arrogant jerk at the same time. Before the war is even over, Wilson's going to draft this peace document. He basically says, you know what? I have the idea to make world peace. I've got it. Meanwhile, a big, horrible, crazy war is going on, and he's supposed to be managing that war. He's in charge of the army. He goes, I've got it. I've come up with the idea. I can solve all of the world problems, and I can bring about world peace. It's called the 14 Points. Now, we're going to discuss this in class in more detail, and it's actually relatively brilliant. It's a pretty good way of solving a lot of the world's problems. It basically gets rid of treaties or secret treaties. It gets rid of naval blockades. It gets rid of tariffs. It gets rid of weapons. It basically settles land disputes. It has this thing called self determination, which basically means that countries and people should be able to rule themselves. It says that we should have free trade, free navigation, and we should create this thing called the League of Nations, a place where countries can get together to settle disputes diplomatically and not have to use their weapons. Wow, that sounds brilliant. That's a brilliant idea. The thing is, you know what it doesn't have? Any punishments for any country for starting this war. It doesn't have any reparations. It doesn't have any, how do I say it? It doesn't have anything that's going to make anyone feel vindicated or make them feel that this war was worth it. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think any war is ever really truly worth it. There's a lot of horrible things that happen in war. War is awful. In fact, the only good war is a short war. The only way to make war humane is to make it short. That's not my quote, but feel free to use it in your senior yearbook. Point here is that really the rest of the world wants revenge for this war, and the 14 points don't give us revenge. It just gives us this peace thing, which is not what the world wants. They want revenge. Well, let's speak of now that the United States has presented its idea for how the world can obtain peace, let's talk about the actual peace that comes from this war. In November of 1918, World War I ended. The fighting stopped. And now it's time to figure out, what are we going to do when it comes to peace? In early 1919, delegates from France, England, the United States, and Italy all get together to discuss a treaty in Versailles, France. Conveniently, it's called the Treaty of Versailles. Hey, look, a treaty not called the Treaty of Paris. How nice is that? Let's talk about the characters in the story. We'll start in the bottom left. That guy's name is David Lloyd George. He's from Great Britain. He wants to keep the British Empire intact, and he wants to keep the peace in the world. All right, that makes sense. Next is this dude named Lord Clemenceau. He's from France. Now, France gets its butt kicked in this war. So, what do the French want? They want to punish the Germans. They want to take away German land, and they want to force the Germans to pay reparations, which is a fancy way of saying pay money for war damages. Next, the next guy we have there is this dude named Vittorio Orlando. He's from Italy. His goal was to gain land, but no one's really going to listen to him because what do the Italians do in this war? The joke is he also didn't speak English and everyone else did, so no one listened to him. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's the joke. Finally, we have Woodrow Wilson, who again had very little to actually do with this war, but his goal is to prevent World War II. He doesn't want a World War II. He wants to make world peace. Here's the problem. Wilson is an idealist. He has great ideas, but he's not a really good politician. People don't like listening to him talk because, again, he's kind of an arrogant jerk. So here's this guy. He shows up late to a war. He basically funds the weapons, or basically builds the weapons for both sides that they've used for 3 years to blow each other up. Then he just comes strolling in late, does very little work, calls himself the victor in the war, and says, okay, now that you kids are done fighting, let daddy show you how this is all going to end up. We're going to make the rules. And the rest of the world's like, who the heck are you? You're this brand new country that no one's ever really heard of. We're relatively young in the world scale. We don't actually do any fighting. We don't really get to declare ourselves MVP, but we do anyway. And the rest of the world doesn't care what we think. But we send this guy that is completely incapable of negotiating with people. He's convinced that he is always right, everyone else is always wrong, and you just don't understand his point of view, so you're wrong. And we're going to send him to negotiate a world peace? What the heck were we thinking? Well, you'll also notice that representatives from Russia, who does a majority of the fighting, not there. No one from Germany is there. That could be a problem. And no one from Japan is there. This is going to lead to some lasting issues that are going to come up in World War II. But again, you've taken world history. You already know that. In June of 1919, Germany is going to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Hey, there's a dog barking next door. Germany is going to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Here's what it says: Germany is going to be completely disarmed. It's going to be stripped of all of her colonies. It's going to be forced to admit fault for the war, and it's going to be forced to pay $56 billion in war reparations. Over 1/10 of its land and over 1/10 of its population and 1/8 of its land is going to be taken away and given to France and Poland. And the Germans are going to have to accept the guilt from the war. It's called the War Guilt Clause. It's not the Germans' fault that this war started. It started because some Serbian dude shot some Austrian guy in Bosnia. Why on earth do the Germans have to accept fault for this war? It didn't start because of them. Now, what about Wilson? His 14 points are going to be completely ignored. No one listened to him. How sad. Well, the only thing that the rest of the world's going to add in is this idea of the League of Nations. That's actually not a bad idea. Not a bad idea at all. A place where countries can discuss things peacefully? That's great. Let's make it. So Europe goes, yeah, let's make a League of Nations. So Wilson comes home and goes, well, at least I got the League of Nations into the treaty. He comes home to the United States and goes, okay, guys, we got to ratify this treaty. Here is the next part of the story. Oh, I forgot about this slide. Hey, check it out. This is the land that Germany lost. For those of you guys that study World War II, you will notice the Danzig Corridor. You will also notice the Alsace-Lorraine. You'll also notice the Rhineland. Those are all stories that come up later. I'll tell them later. In fact, I might even delete the slide. You may not see this in the video lecture. Perhaps I'm just talking to myself. Okay, we're almost done. Let's get this over with. Okay, so as you guys have all read in your Constitution, the president can negotiate treaties, but they're only official if Congress decides to sign on to them. So, Wilson's going to send the treaty back to Congress, specifically the Senate, for them to ratify it, to make it law. Problem is, Republicans in the Senate don't like this treaty. They're not very big on this at all. There are going to be two groups of Republicans here. We have one that's called the Irreconcilables, which basically says the League of Nations is the stupidest idea ever and we refuse to ever sign on with it. The other group of Republicans are called the Reservationists. They're led by a dude named Henry Cabot Lodge. And they basically say, League of Nations might be okay, but let's make it really super weak. We don't want it to have any authority over the United States. A big fight breaks out. Henry Cabot Lodge and Woodrow Wilson do not get along. They completely disagree over really how the rest of the world should be run. It's actually a pretty nasty fight that breaks out. Wilson refuses to accept a weakened treaty, and the American public does not support this treaty either. The United States does not sign the Treaty of Versailles, and we do not join the League of Nations. Well, what was so weak about this treaty? Again, this is going to be a bit of a spoiler alert for World War II, but, what the heck, we're already here. Many people in the world thought the United States should stay completely out of European affairs. The Germans are going to be upset by a war guilt clause. Colonized countries did not like being controlled by the League of Nations, and they wanted their independence. Japan and Italy were completely ignored and didn't get what they wanted. Germany and Russia aren't going to be involved in the negotiations, and the League of Nations has no power because the United States is not part of it. This is a pretty bad idea. I think you can all agree. Lastly, Europe is bankrupt. They're out of money. And all of these rules and restrictions are going to be put on Germany. But really, as the 1920s roll on, Europe's going to go through an economic depression. The United States is going to go through a Great Depression. And it turns out no one's going to watch Germany. What is Germany going to do now that no one is babysitting it to make sure it follows the rules? You'll have to wait and see when we talk about World War II. But I bet you can guess, because you're pretty smart. And you've already taken a course on this before. I hope. Okay, let's talk about the legacy of this war. Legacy of this war. The extreme patriotism has a cultural backlash. Lynchings continue in the South, and a new backlash against socialists breaks out, known as the Red Scare. Now, I did not talk about the Communist Revolution, I did not talk about socialism, but the United States is afraid of socialism. Think about it. Socialism basically implies that the wealthy and the business owners should give up their money and spread it evenly among the population. If you're a wealthy person, what incentive do you possibly have to join a socialist society? Socialism sounds really good if you're poor. If you're rich, socialism sounds terrible. Many Americans are rich, they don't like this idea. So we have this general fear of a Russian Revolution taking place in the United States. We call it the First Red Scare. Here's a hint. There's going to be two Red Scares. They're both about the same thing for the same reason, but they happen at different times. Conveniently, they both happen during a world war or around a world war. The Red Scare means that we are afraid of socialism taking hold in America. To make sure that there aren't any communists in America or any socialists in America, we send out this dude. His name is Mitchell Palmer. He's the leader of the Justice Department. And we start basically rounding up anyone that we can find that has any sort of socialist leanings, and we arrest them without a warrant. During the course of the Palmer raids, over 6,000 suspected socialists are going to be arrested, and over 500 are going to be deported out of the country for socialist activities, whatever that means. And you know what? Maybe we need to invent a new federal agency that's going to basically investigate Americans to see if there's any sort of socialist activities going on. Perhaps you've heard of them. They're called the FBI. Labor unions at this time period are also going to be under attack because they basically begin to go on violent strikes when the boys come home from war. People were convinced that labor unions were controlled by socialists, and the government begins to crack down on them again, and labor unions actually end up disappearing. Let's talk about some other dissent in this country during this time period. Americans are basically going to become almost hysterical in the support of the United States during this war. And anyone who did not support the United States was obviously a horrible person that deserved to be killed and kicked out. And they were an outcast in society. How serious was this? How serious was this propaganda? How serious was this patriotism? Here is a famous quote from this time period. If you turn hell upside down, you'll find the words made in Germany. So can you imagine what you would say if you said, hey, guys, maybe this war isn't a good idea? Things aren't going to go so well. In fact, 3.6 million men refused to sign up for the draft, mostly people from the South. And a bunch of anti-war activities are going to break out in the United States. In 1918, the Espionage Act is basically going to set fines and determine prison times for loosely defined anti-war activities. In fact, there's even going to be a sedition amendment, which was added onto this, basically gave stiff fines to anyone using disloyal language against the government, war, or flag. Wait a minute. Didn't we do this before, last time the United States went to war? You guys remember the Alien and Sedition Acts? This idea that if you talk bad about the government in a time of war, you're basically leading to the destruction of the country, and you shouldn't be allowed to do it? Wait a minute. The Alien and Sedition Acts were seen as one of the worst acts ever done by the government. How on earth could we let them happen again? We do. That's what Americans do when they're afraid. That's what Americans do when we're at war. Spoiler alert, we did this again in your lifetime. Or if you're listening to this after 2015, before you were born. The biggest idea of dissent during this time period comes from a Supreme Court case called Schneck versus the United States. Essentially what happens here is that Schneck is a guy that tells Americans to burn their draft cards and not sign up for the draft. The American government is going to call this, they're not going to say that this is free speech. They're going to say this is a violation of America, basically. They're going to say that this is speech that hurts the American soldiers, and hence it is speech against the United States. It makes a clear and present danger to the safety and the security of the United States, so it cannot be supported. It's a fancy way of saying even the Supreme Court agrees During a time of war, you do not have free speech. Now, I'm going to end this chapter the same way that your book does. I'm going to end this video the same way that your book does. Let's talk about the election of 1920. The war is now over, and Wilson is thinking about taking a third term, but, he's basically almost dead at this point, so that ain't going to happen. And now we got to pick some new people. The Democrats are going to pick this guy named James Cox, pictured here in the bottom left, who is a mild progressive. He's going to run with a vice presidential candidate named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who's a relative unknown, but he's a Roosevelt, so that makes him popular. But Democrats don't win this. Instead, who wins this election is going to be this guy named Warren G. Harding, a senator from Ohio, of all places. He promised America a return to normalcy. Basically, he goes, look, that war was crazy, but we won, America, USA, USA. But wouldn't it be nice if we can go back to what the world was like before the war? Wouldn't that be better for everyone if we could just go back to normalcy? And America's like, is that a word? Is normalcy a word? Shouldn't he have just said, can't we go back to the way things were before, when things were more normal? So while Americans are scratching their heads going, if that's actually a word, what ends up happening is that, you know what? It would be a good idea to go back to how things were before the war made everything crazy. Let's go back to an America of peace. Let's go back to an America of isolationism. But more importantly, let's keep all that money we just made to ourselves. Good work, guys. I know this is a tough chapter. I'm not going to lie, this is a time period that even I don't understand all that well. But hopefully we got through it together and this clears up some confusion you may have. Good luck on your test.